as adults, as parents, as caregivers, we don't have to be perfect. We can't be perfect in this. This is a new experience for all of us. We're all learning from this, but we can build resiliency and draw from other stressful times in our lives. And so we really share and talk about the importance of, again, coping and managing your own stress, and then also being able to be healthy and well to help your children also cope and manage that stress.
A landmark study by Kaiser Permanente that dates back 25 years found that more than 3 out of 5 youth in the U.S. will experience at least one adverse event during their childhood. A K-State Research and Extension Family and Child Development Agent in the Frontier District in Ottawa says that means our co-workers, friends, family, and community members may have experienced childhood adversity. On today's Sound Living, how toxic stress caused by adverse childhood experiences affects children. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman. Rebecca McFarland, a guest on the Extension Files podcast produced by K-State Research and Extension and hosted by Jason Hackett and Randall Kowalik, discussed how family and community are among the important buffers for alleviating or preventing the effects of toxic stress. While toxic stress can cause long-term negative effects, Rebecca, who authored an extension publication, Understanding the Impact of Childhood Adversity and Toxic Stress, tells Jason that some stress is good for children and that it's a normal part of their growth and development.
And those short-term, everyday stress experiences, like, getting a toy taken away from another child, really helps that child to learn how to cope or deal with stress. And it's really important for, adults, for parents, for caregivers to help that child deal with that stress. And so we talk about the importance of having a loving, caring adult, again, that helps that child learn how to cope with and deal with those challenges. We talk about tolerable stress, and that occurs when a child experiences are more severe, they're longer lasting. And examples of those might be challenges or relationship problems between parents, loss of a loved one, or maybe it's a natural disaster. They're considered tolerable because there is an adult or caregiver, a parent there that, again, provides that support. That parent, adult, that caregiver helps the child to adapt to that stress. And when that stress is removed, then we know that that child's brain and the organs are able to recover. And then we talk about toxic stress, and that is when a child experiences adversity that's longer lasting. It's more extreme and severe. And examples of those would be parental depression, poverty is one, family violence as well. And, I think it's really interesting. We talk about that fight, flight, or freeze response, which is our body's response to stress. And there's a lot going on physiologically in our body when that occurs. And so it really does impact the child's brain development. It impacts their entire body.
So as you look at that spectrum of stress, then where do you think we kind of sit right now with, especially for kids that have gone through now having to figure out how to do school from home? There's all these worries about catching coronavirus. Does all of that fit more into the tolerable stress, or is it more of a toxic stress type of a thing? Or does that depend kind of on the home situation and other factors?
What we know about stress is it's really individualized. Although we know generally how stress impacts children, how stress in their home impacts them, we also know that it's individualized. And so some children may experience similar stresses or stressors, but it does not impact them the same way. So your question about, the current situation and dealing with the coronavirus, staying at home, parents working from home as well, and trying to balance all of that, it could be a tolerable stress, or it may be going to toxic stress for some of our children. It really depends on those adults in that home, the caregivers, the parents, whomever it may be, and how they are able to adapt with those challenges and the unknown as well. And for those of us that, again, work in our communities and counties and work with families and individuals, it's really important that we think about providing those resources. We talk about self-care, and those parents and caregivers have to take care of themselves, as well as caring for their children. They also need to be in a place where they can be healthy and well themselves to be able to care for their children too. We know that routines are important, although it's so important to be flexible as well. And so we've encouraged families, we've encouraged parents and caregivers to try to maintain those routines as much as possible. There's a lot of unknown right now, but those routines can really help us through this time. Those routines can also help our children during this time as well.
Rebecca, can you talk a little bit about what's at stake here if we don't have routines and if children live in a situation of toxic stress? What kind of long-term effects does that have on a child?
So I'm going to share a little bit about, how our children learn about the world in which we live in. And that really is developed at a very young age. When a baby is born, they're helpless. They rely on their parents and other caregivers to provide for their needs, their basic needs of getting fed, changing their diapers, also soothing them, being there emotionally for them as well. When they cry, when they're uncomfortable, meeting those needs. And so at that young age, from birth, we know that children learn about the world they live in. And it really is impacted by those relationships at birth. They develop a sense of whether the world is safe or unsafe, whether they can trust other people and understand their own value as an individual through those relationships. So when those relationships are unstable, when their home environment is unstable, when they cry and they don't get their needs met, whether it's because they're hungry or because they need to be held, they need that emotional security, they need that feeling of closeness, or the diaper needs to be changed, whatever it may be, when those needs are not met, the child learns that no one's going to meet my needs, that I'm not important. And so, again, it's really important at that young age that we're able to meet child's needs. Again, not only those physical needs, but emotional are important as well. And so if at an early age, children experience toxic stress because the environment is very unstable, they're in an environment where there's violence, and talking about in the home, but also in the community as well. Their parents or caregivers don't have the finances to provide for their basic needs. So they experience that toxic stress, and it can have some negative consequences. And again, I want to say it can have, because we know that not all children who experience childhood adversity experience negative effects. But some of the signs and symptoms could be headaches or frequent illnesses. They might have some stomach aches or digestive problems. They may have a poor appetite. They might have difficulty identifying or expressing and managing their own emotions. They may experience depression or anxiety or anger. Their body is in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. As they continue to grow and to develop, they might at school react to things that trigger that emotional response once again. And as become adults, and I provided some training for our juvenile detention center here in Ottawa, talking about trauma and how we develop systems that are trauma informed and trauma responsive, recognizing that there are children and adults who've experienced trauma, and we don't want to re-traumatize them when they come and interact with us to receive assistance, or maybe when they're in the juvenile detention center. Again, some of those early interactions, early experiences impact our children greatly. Some of the other maybe behavioral or cognitive signs and symptoms of toxic stress is they lack impulse control or the ability to think through consequences. And they may behave in ways that are unpredictable, oppositional, volatile, or extreme. They engage in high-risk behaviors as well. Our children then, because of those, the brain circuits have been developed. They're used over and over again. And so those brain circuits they've developed to cope with the toxic stress, those become really strong. And so then it has not allowed their brain to develop the thinking skills, to think clearly, to reason or problem solve. And they're not able to plan ahead or anticipate the future. They may struggle with sustaining attention or have learning difficulties. what we know about, brain development is that the prefrontal cortex, the front part of our brain, is the part that develops last. We think about adolescent development and how adolescents develop. The reasoning, the problem solving, the logical thinking, all of that is really one of the last parts to develop. But again, because the other parts of their brain that reacts to the emotions, the trauma, the toxic stress, those highways, those connections are strengthened because of the child experiencing that.
And you mentioned a training that you did recently for other extension agents. Can you talk a little bit about both the training aspect as well as what K-State Research and Extension is doing to try to help educate our own colleagues and then find ways to extend that help out through our communities?
Yes. So every year we have what we call a Family and Consumer Sciences annual lesson series. And so as an author of that topic, then we develop a leader's guide as well as a fact sheet. So the leader's guide is provided for the Family Consumer Sciences agent, or perhaps it's a community member, can utilize this as a lesson and provide the information in their community to different groups in their community, whether it's educators, civic groups, faith community, wherever it may be. This training that I did was over the fact sheet that I developed in Leader's Guide, understanding the impact of childhood adversity and toxic stress.
Maybe one thing to kind of wrap us up, the last little subhead in the publication is resiliency and hope. Maybe that's a good way to wrap this up and kind of touch on a little bit more. You mentioned resilience before and just that idea also of hope.
I personally have a lot of hope. And I think we can do a lot as community members, friends and family members to help develop resiliency and provide hope. Again, providing hope for children, for our families, whether that's maybe a meal or two to help them get by to the end of the month. Maybe it's there to help care for their children for 3 or 4 hours. There's a lot of things, again, that we can do. One of the things that I put in this fact sheet as well is that research on resilience in children shows that an essential protective factor, which decreases the likelihood that the child will develop those health risks and behaviors, is that positive, caring, and protective parent or caregiver. So we can absolutely fulfill that role as that positive, caring, protective parent or caregiver. Other buffers, and there's buffers at the individual, family, and community level that can help alleviate or prevent the effects of toxic stress. And we know that individual buffers are things like personal traits or characteristics such as intellect, self-efficacy, I can do this, or an individual's belief in his or ability to complete a certain task. Again, helping them develop those coping skills. Those family level buffers include being supported, providing those resources, helping that family stick together when times get tough. Sometimes, we're more critical of people when times are tough. And so really providing that support, encouraging them to stick together, and employment as well. Community level buffers include peer relationships. I talked about mentoring. Again, that social support and making sure that our families, our parents have jobs that provide for the basic, living expenses for our families. But also, beyond that, we're starting to look into family-friendly workplaces. Do our policies really promote family and help our employees care for their families? Or because they have to take off because the child is sick, we mark them up, and then after 3 marks, then they no longer have a job. So really being mindful of what do our policies look like, and are they family-friendly work policies to really help and encourage our employees to care for their families.
That's Rebecca McFarland, the K-State Research and Extension Family and Child Development Agent in the Frontier District. She was a guest on the K-State podcast, The Extension Files, hosted by Jason Hackett and Randall Kowalik. To listen to the full podcast, visit ksre.ksu.edu/news. Click on Radio Network, then Other Programs, then The Extension Files. Sound Living is a weekly public affairs program produced by Research and Extension at Kansas State University. I'm Jeff Wichman, and this is the K-State Radio Network.